Okay, chapter 15 of the NASM 7th edition Certified Personal Trainer textbook. And chapter 15 is on cardiorespiratory fitness training. Remember, chapter 14, flexibility training. And just keep in mind that as you go through these chapters, have a piece of paper, writing implement to help you with your study to make it efficient and effective on time, so that you can memorize the information as well as be able to use it at some point. And to be honest with you, once you get into chapter 15, there's really a lot of meat and potato here when it comes to what you actually should be using right now in your training, you personally, and what you'll be doing with your clients. I love chapter 15. I love cardiorespiratory training as from the academic standpoint, because it's relatively simple to implement in the real world, because you have all these hard, fast numbers. You have, this percent of this, you have the VT1, you have these very specific numbers that you can use to develop your programming. Of course, as always, the most challenging part is actually getting your clients to be consistent with it and to do it properly. Chapter 15 is basically going to give you an in-depth explanation of exactly how we do cardio training with clients. And so keep in mind the goal here in chapter 15 is going to be focused essentially on stage training, and we'll get into that. And there's a number of concepts and ideas that are just review from previous chapters. Again, it's a good thing that there is some review. It's one of the reasons why, as you've gone through the previous chapters, once you get here, you'll be a little bit more familiar, to be a little bit more comfortable. You'll be exposed to the material, right? The frequency of exposures is increased, and then it should start to make sense. And so, chapter 15. Let's go ahead and remember, take a look at your at your sidebars. Make sure that you know those definitions. They were put there for sidebars were put there for a reason, so that it would target you, focus you on some of the most important critical components of the chapter. Of course, the learning objectives as well. Good to read. I'm gonna focus you right now onto page 487. Just kind of move up, and there's a helpful hint box up here that NASM gave you, and it gives you the 5 components of fitness. So this is just kind of keep this in mind, wink, wink. There's 5 main components of fitness for humans, right? So cardiorespiratory or aerobic fitness, muscular strength, muscular endurance, flexibility, and then body composition, right? So all of those individually tell us things about the level of conditioning and health that a person is in, or how fit they are. And each one can be worked, right, on its own, but in sequences that allow us to create the integrated training model. So those five components, good idea to take a look at that. So introduction to cardiorespiratory fitness training, basically just the definition of cardiorespiratory fitness, ADLs. Now, ADLs, activities of daily living. The idea here is that cardio training will help and benefit just everyday activities. My wife is an occupational therapist, so they do that from a therapeutic standpoint, ADLs, activities of daily living. So when you read through that, it'll start to make sense that there's a real world component to this that's very, very important. And then another concept that's critical, particularly in cardio training, is this idea of the rate of progression, or how fast you move clients through these different stages of training. Again, with cardio training, we have objective biomarkers. Just keep that in mind as we go through this chapter. We have objective biomarkers. We don't have to guess a whole lot. One of the reasons why we always recommend that you use a heart rate monitor, or like a Fitbit that you would put on your wrist, so you can get an accurate assessment of heart rate, because heart rate is really, at the end of the day, heart rate is really that biomarker that allows us to make adjustments, push people harder, slow them down. Heart rate becomes the sort of the main variable that we use, that we look at to help us with our clients through this programming. So keep that in mind. if we were able to know the exact point, like we spoke about in a previous chapter, if we knew exactly where glucose and free fatty acids were being used, 50-50 in muscle metabolism, if we knew it and knew that heart rate, no problem. But we don't, because we're not testing people like that. So what we need to do is have another way to figure it out, and it's going to be through breathing, right? So we ultimately, our end goal is to be able to know heart rate, because that gives us an indication of the other variables that are going on inside the body, right? We want to know, glucose, free fatty acids. We want to know respiration. We want to know all of these things because they're going to tell us something about where an individual is when it comes to training stages or training zones that will lead to the specific stages that we're going to use. So keep that in mind. Heart rate is really the goal. We want to be able to monitor heart rate, look at heart rate, make our decisions on training based on heart rate. And so that's what we're going to get into. And again, a couple of these things are review. So it's a good idea to either go back, review them more in depth, or stick with this. And if you do remember what these terms and concepts mean, then so much the better. So what are the benefits of cardiorespiratory fitness? And so you can read through that. Some of this is intuitive and not that critical to spend a whole lot of time. It is, again, intuitive, lowers morbidity rate, mortality rate, things like that. But we do know that there's some criteria that we have to really keep in mind when we talk about the benefits, quote, the benefits of cardiorespiratory fitness. And that's what we're going to move into, the general guidelines. And so table 15.1 is really a critical table to know. It's short, it's easy to memorize this material, but aerobic activity recommendations, the big number here is 150, right? You should be thinking 150 and 75. 150 minutes per week is the recommended amount of time, total aggregate amount of time that individual, look, this is the research. The research has pretty much panned out and given us sort of this basic guideline. Is it 149 minutes? Is it 152? I don't know. It's 150, gives us a rough guideline, roughly 5 days a week, 30 minutes of cardiorespiratory training. Now, this is conducted and performed at a specific intensity level. We'll talk about that. Moderate intensity aerobic activity. So brisk walking, for instance. And these are key terms to keep in mind, because if somebody says, well, what should I do for cardiovascular training? Well, you can do really one of two, perhaps three things, depending on if you're an athlete or not. And that's what's listed here in table 5.1. So at least 5 days per week, 150 minutes per week total. So that would come out to approximately 30 minutes for your daily cardio training workout. Now, if you can't do 5 days a week, not a problem. In one sense, not a problem. You can train 3 days a week, but the goal is to get 75 minutes. So now you're looking 30, 60, 25 minutes, 25 minutes, 3 days a week, something like that. 25 minutes, 3 days a week, right? 25, 50, 75, something like that. But that has to be performed at a high intensity level. And so there's a trade-off. If you have more time during the week to do it, you don't have to do it at such a high intensity level. Again, these are standard recommendations right now that we have from the American Heart Association in particular. So you can do a combination of the two. Gee, isn't that nice? You can do 1 day really high intensity, and that kind of counts for like 2 days of moderate intensity. Not exactly, but the idea is you can combine them. And basically what we're saying is that for clients, there's a reality. It's called life. Sometimes I can't get a workout in on Monday because I'm at work till late. And it's 7 o'clock, or whatever the case is. The reality is that I can't get that workout in. Well, guess what? If on Tuesday you can train, just do it at a higher intensity level, and you'll sort of, quote, make up for what you were unable to do on Monday. So this is the idea when it comes to the recommendations and the frequency, right? So the frequency, number of days per week, and then the intensity is the level of demand that's placed on the body, right, for that given activity. And so intensity, when it comes to cardiorespiratory training, is generally going to be dictated by percent of max heart rate. And so that's going to allow us, as long as we know what our predicted max heart rate is, we can just develop these percentages, right? We can also know ventilatory threshold 1. Remember, the whole goal here is intensity is going to be dictated by heart rate. So we use percent of max heart rate, however we want to determine it, but ultimately it's heart rate. So I need to know my heart rate, and I need to know what my predicted max heart rate is. I need to know what my heart rate is at ventilatory threshold 1. Now, ideally, I would like to know what VT2 is as well, but remember what we talked about in previous chapters is that ventilatory threshold 2 testing is pretty intense, and it's not going to, you're simply not going to do a VT2 field test on an average sedentary individual. Just not necessary. At some point, when they do become more fit and able to do that field test, absolutely. But remember, VT2 testing is going to get an individual up to, almost 80% on average, not for everybody, but roughly 80, even 85%, if not higher, of max heart rate. That could be substantially challenging for the average detrained individual. So just keep that in mind. This is personal training. Everybody is unique, but we're going to use these specific variables and calculations to help that unique individual to get their training program developed. So there are methods. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. That we want the frequency is easy. Look, train every day if you can. If you can't, then you're going to back it down to the number of days that you can. And depending on what those number of days are, that should determine how you should be training. Now, that's that beginning part of this. So frequency is simple. Intensity is simple in one sense. We have the percentages, we have the numbers, we know what you should be doing. What are the methods then for assigning exercise intensity? Maximal heart rate. Now, for most of us, if you recall, and I'll just write this out. For most of us, we generally remember this equation 220 minus your age. So your predicted max heart rate was equal to 220 minus your age. If I'm 20 years old, then my predicted max heart rate would be 200. Now, it does not mean that your max heart rate, your max heart rate is actually 200. It's just a good indicator. This comes from many data points, years of researchers doing enough testing to get this sort of average. So it's close enough. If you're really detrained or you're really, really fit, that number will change. Everybody's different, by the way, but again, it's good enough, close enough for the average person. However, there are other equations, and now the more accurate, the more accurate way to do it is to use what we call the Tanaka Formula. Tanaka Formula. And the Tanaka Formula it's going to get you very close to this, but basically it's going to be 208 minus 0.7 times your age. And so the idea is that now we're using age, right? Because age is a primary indicator of how high your heart rate can go. The older you get, all things being equal, your max heart rate will go down. You simply cannot get your heart rate up as high when you're 50 as when you're 40, as when you were 30. How much of a difference that is, it's not relevant. So the Tanaka Formula, which you have here on page 489, really very simple. Again, if I'm 20 years old, right, 0.7 times 20 is going to be, so 20 years old times 0.7 is going to give me 14. So 208 minus 14, if my math is correct, that's a 4194. So you can see the difference. Okay, let me just check my math. 8 times minus 4, 20 minus 119. So 200 versus 194. Now, that could make a significant, difference depending on the individual. And so do that for yourself. Of course, there's a difference. Is 194 versus 200 a big difference, significant difference? It could be for an athlete. It could be for, a highly detrained individual. The point is that difference could be significant. And so normally now what we do is we use the Tanaka Formula to help us calculate. Once you have this predicted max heart rate, whatever it is, once you have that, now we can start to make intensity assignments. We can now say 60% of max heart rate, 80% of max heart rate, whatever it is, whatever that target heart rate is that you want to get. Now, the next formula to know is the heart rate reserve. And heart rate reserve, again, I'll just shoot this up here for you. Heart rate reserve, because we use this in the what's known as the Carvonen method of determining target heart rate. Dr. Carvonen came up with this equation, and basically what he did in his research was he looked at individuals not just by age but also by their resting heart rate. So and why is that important? Because the lower your resting heart rate, everything else being equal, the lower your resting heart rate, the more indicative of the strength or power of the heart. Okay, everything else being equal. If your heart rate is 60 beats per minute, right? 60 beats per minute, and you train cardio-wise and get your cardiorespiratory fitness stronger and better, normally what happens is that resting heart rate goes down. And this is one of the reasons why when we look at athletes and marathoners, they have resting heart rates in the 50s, right? In the 50s, 54 beats per minute. I've known individuals, just incredible athletes with resting heart rates at 40, and in some cases at 38. Now that is a massively powerful heart. That could be that's a level of hypertrophy, cardiac hypertrophy, that could verge on clinically significant, and not in a good way. And so, but this can actually happen. Normally we see high level athletes with their resting heart rates in the 50s, even low 50s, not uncommon. And so that's the understanding. So what Dr. Carvonen did was he did research and basically included as a modifier to what a potential max heart rate could be, a modifier he used resting heart rate. So heart rate reserve is simply your max heart rate, max, minus your resting heart rate. And you'll see these designations, rest. Okay. And that is the heart rate. That's the heart rate reserve. Now remember, if I'm a well-conditioned athlete, think about this for a second. At the same age, everything being equal, you have a well-conditioned athlete and a detrained individual who has a higher resting heart rate? Well, the deconditioned individual. The athlete or the individual that's well conditioned should, again, everything else being equal, have a lower resting heart rate because the heart is stronger, doesn't need to beat as often. A higher number here, right, will change the heart rate reserve. So again, if they're the same age, let's just say take a 20-year-old using the 220 minus your age. A 20-year-old will have a max heart rate estimated at 200. Okay, so if I use 200 minus resting heart rate, let's use 60 for a detrained individual, my heart rate reserve is equal to 40. Heart rate reserve. However, a trained individual, very strong cardiorespiratory wise, let's say at 54, again, same age, 200 minus 54 will give us a higher number, and then it will be, so the more fit an individual, the higher the heart rate reserve, and that's where now we're able to use the Carvonen method to calculate our target heart rate. Okay, so I hope that's helpful, because it can be a little confusing if you're just looking at the calculation. Again, the concept behind it is that as an individual becomes more fit cardiovascular wise, their resting heart rate tends to go lower. That is a biomarker that helps us to understand the level of fitness that an individual is at. Everybody's different, of course. But that's kind of the idea. I hope that is helpful. The Tanaka formula, 208 minus 0.7 times your age. The heart rate reserve is going to be your max heart rate, predicted max heart rate, minus your resting. That gives you a number. Now, of course, at the bottom of 489, we use the heart rate reserve method, or the Carvonen method, to determine target heart rate. Whatever my desired intensity level is, whatever that percent of desired intensity level is, I can multiply that by my heart rate reserve. So if my heart rate reserve is 46, or for whatever that number is, I can now multiply that by my desired intensity, let's say 70%. All I have to do at that point is then add back in, you can see the way this formula works out. I add that back in to my resting heart rate, and that gets me back up to this desired intensity level, or target heart rate. And you can see, consider the following example. Do it on yourself. It's not a bad idea just to work on this, do it by yourself, and you get this client's target heart rate of 170, right? You can work your way through that formula. Metabolic equivalence. We normally don't use metabolic equivalence in our everyday dealings with clients, but you should know what a MET is. It's basically the equivalent to the body at rest, right? How much oxygen is being used? How much actual metabolic activity is occurring per minute per kilogram of body weight by an individual when they're at rest? That's going to be a certain number. And then if we start to increase our intensity of training, for instance, we're actually requiring more oxygen, more energy demands. That number is 3.5 milliliters of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight. So often what you'll see is that this exercise requires 3 METs, 6 METs, 5 METs. Basically what it's saying is that your body's demand, or metabolic demand, for oxygen is 3 times what it is when you're at rest. That's a metabolic equivalent. It's more of a research clinical number that we use, but it's not a bad idea to know it. Ratings of perceived exertion. Without a heart rate monitor, you basically have to use some other method to get your client to tell you where they perceive themselves to be in intensity. And so the talk test, ventilatory threshold is again, that's kind of the, for the personal trainer, VT and VT1, knowing that heart rate at VT1 is becoming more and more kind of the gold standard in field testing and training and figuring out where a client should be training at. At least that's what I've always liked to use. If I know heart rate at VT1, I'm good. I'm really good, because now I know training should be below VT1, at little above, and then I can take them up into higher and higher intensities above VT. But if I know VT1, that's a great biomarker. The talk test, again, is another way, and tables 15.2 and 15.3. 15.2 is no longer, we just don't use that. I don't think I've ever used the original 6 to 20 scale. I'm being honest with you. Everything I've always used on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm getting down and dirty. When I'm training my clients, I want to know quick. I can't be thinking 11, 13. No, I know between 1 and 10. If you tell me you're at a 6 or a 7, perfect. 60, 70% of max heart rate. Now, I also know my clients will say, oh, I'm at an 8. Come on, seriously? You're not even sweating hard. You're at a 3. Who are you kidding? So the perceived exertion scale is a down and dirty, easy, simple way to get an immediate response from your client. Again, if you don't have a heart rate monitor, you really need to get one. You need to use them. They're one of the best pieces of equipment you can have when you're training clients. Honestly, I won't train anybody if they don't have a heart rate monitor. I mean, heck, I'll buy it for you if I got to, but that is the key weapon when it comes to doing cardio training. It just makes life so much easier. So on page 492, of course, there's your VT1 again. Now, table 15.4 is actually really important to look at and know, because it's giving you those different methods. So VO2 max, you're not doing that. Everything we do with VO2 max in the real world, in a training scenario, is being discovered through sub-maximal testing, which is the VT1 VT method, right? Sub-max. You're not putting people on a treadmill with a crash cart with a oxygen mask and doing a true maximal oxygen consumption test. Okay, I mean, if you can, well, that's great. But you do sub-max testing, and that's what we're able to do with the 3-minute step-up test, if you recall from previous chapters. So maximal heart rate. So here are some formulas that you definitely want to just write down, make sure and do it with your friends and family, and just make sure you got them down. Very, very simple, very straightforward. Other variables to keep in mind, obviously, for cardio training is the amount of time or the duration that you're doing it. Is it 20 minutes? Is it 30 minutes? You know, the reality is that if I'm training people in a business model where I've got 1 hour, 45 minutes to train them, you know, and I'm doing my flexibility, I'm doing my strength training endurance, I don't have an hour for cardio to do. So I might be training people for 20 minutes. So that puts a cap on the total amount of time. I'm going to have to train them at higher intensity, right? Remember, moderate intensity for 30 minutes, 5 days a week. See, I am constrained. You are constrained, and that's good. You're constrained by the things we know that the research has shown are pretty well understood when it comes to physiology. The type, obviously, do you like to walk? Do you like to jog? It's one of the reasons on your initial assessment, you want to know what people like to do. I love to swim. So if you love to swim, great. Let's make that one of the activities, the type or mode of training that you're going to do. So, and then of course there's interval training and high intensity interval training. Nothing difficult to understand about interval training. We've been doing it for literally decades. You know, it's one of the ways that we used to get athletes in. We would do we used to call it conditioning training. Of course, now it's HIIT training, high intensity interval training. And all HIIT training is, and all interval training is changing the level of intensity during a particular workout session. That's all it is. So you have interval training, which is, opposite to or sort of adjacent to what's known as steady state training, 20 minutes at 70% max heart rate, which is the way we generally used to train the average client. And there's a reason for that, because for the average client, they might not be able to even do 10, 15 minutes at or close to VT1 or just below it. And we got to get them there. We got to get the duration minimum 20 minutes so that we can get them in the process of training to the standards that we talked about. Okay, so high intensity interval training is just a way of moderating the level of intensity that you bring a person into before they go through the recovery phase. So you get them to warm up and they do, kind of all out, and then they recover. Heart rate comes back down and you do it again. Boom, heart rate goes up for a specific period of time, 30 seconds, a minute, whatever that is. And then you let their heart rate recover. And that's what interval training, the general concept, high intensity interval training, is just a more specific way of getting the interval itself, that higher intensity from recovery, up to a certain level. That's all HIIT training really is, versus steady state. Two kind of unique methods of this moderating the intensity is Tabata training and Fartlek training. Fartlek training was a method still used today, but it's a Swedish term that was used to find a specific way of changing the intensity of a training with no real formalized variables in it, right? So run hard for 30 seconds, recover. And what do you want to do next? Well, let's run not as hard for 60 seconds. And it was a less structured. So Fartlek training is a less structured way of doing interval training. That's really all it is. So enjoyment and volume. Volume is the total amount of work that's performed during an actual training session. In cardio, it's basically going to be the intensity of what you're doing, and the total number of days a week that you're doing it, plus the time you're doing it, and you total that up. Normally we'll look at volume on a weekly basis. It makes more sense to say, on a week, during the week, I generally get this amount of volume, right? I train 5 days a week for 30 minutes. I did 150 minutes at moderate levels of intensity. That's one way to look at volume. On page 495, we move into progression. How are you advancing your client through their cardio training? Recommendations then are, this is where you're going to spend the majority of your time in this particular chapter, because there are three basic components to the cardiorespiratory fitness training that you're going to do. Three phases: warm up, the actual exercise itself at the target heart rate, or what's known as the conditioning phase, and then the cool down. So you warm up, you train, and you warm down. You got to do the warm up and you've got to do the warm down. It's critical. People have gotten hurt seriously by not doing a warm down. If they are deconditioned, their heart rates are up so high, their bodies are not prepared for this, just stopping. You've got to get the heart rate to come back down, and that's what the cool down or the warm down phase will do. So you do general warm up and a specific warm up. These two phases are going to be roughly 5 to 10 minutes, roughly. Everybody's different, of course, but that's going to be the general guidelines. And there are some suggested warm-up activities. The goal of a warm-up is not to train the individual, right? So you don't want the warm-up so intense that the individual is already in the conditioning phase. Make sure the warm-up is 5 to 10 minutes. Heart gets elevated. People start to feel like they're sweating, right? And you know, if they're starting to breathe really hard, you've moved into the conditioning phase. Okay. The warm-up is always, always below VT1. So if during a warm-up, an individual is going and they're breathing really hard, well, you've moved past VT1, right? Because we know where VT1 is. It's when breathing becomes challenging. Okay, so that's an easy way to know that they've gone outside of that. And so table 15.5 gives you a little bit of a benefits and effects of doing the warm-up. The conditioning phase now is where you're going to start to use zone 1, 2, 3, 4 training concepts and focusing on stages of training. You can do flexibility training, as you see here, flexibility training during the cool down. Absolutely, it's one of the best times to do your flexibility training because the tissue extensibility has increased because it's warm. The tissues have gotten increased core body temperature, increase in the temperature of the actual soft tissue. Now's a great time to do the flexibility training. And the muscle spindle fibers are not going to be as active. Remember, muscle spindle fibers, that's what tells the muscle to contract. When the muscle has been training and it's warm, you've done your entire 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is, muscle spindle fiber activation tends to be decreased, which will allow for the muscles to lengthen more readily. How's that for a perfect opportunity to do your flexibility, right? This would be more of your static type stretching, but you can also do the self-myofascial release, things like that. So now we get into the conditioning component, right? And the conditioning component of your cardio training is going to be done in a stage training fashion. All stage training is telling you is that at these specific stages, there are certain ways you want to deal with an individual's training based on heart rate, right? And the ideal scenario is that you get their VT1 level, because VT1 and VT2 basically allow you to determine what are called zones. So zone, you may have heard the concept of zone training, okay? But what NASM does is NASM talks about stage training using the zone concept. So let me show you. It's helpful to get a look at this from the perspective of the zone concept. And what I'll do is let me just go ahead and turn this this way so you can see the idea with, and we'll get back to the actual pages. But by the way, this begins on page 501 where you'll get into the stages and what the stages actually mean. The beauty of knowing your ventilatory threshold 1 heart rate and knowing your VT2 heart rate is that it allows you to create a very simple, straightforward training program for your clients. So the idea is that, remember, we have a continuum of heart rate. So this is your heart rate, right? At rest, it might be 60 beats per minute. Your max might be 200 beats per minute, right? So that's the heart rate, right? So this is your predicted max heart rate. And basically what VT allows you to do is to get that heart rate, right, which is a critical biomarker for training. And if this is your VT1, and I'm assuming you know what it is, whatever that is, I don't know, but whatever that heart rate is, we now have a distinctive crossover point that allows us to break out training into different zones. So zone 1 technically is anything below VT1. If your ventilatory threshold 1 that you measured with a client is, I don't know, let's just say it's 120 beats per minute, that's great, because now we can tell our clients, this is where I want you to train. This is where your heart rate should be when you're training. If we know VT2, this is another important, you don't have to know it, because if you did not do a VT2 field test, it's because the individual is not ready for that level of testing or assessment intensity. But once you do, and you know what VT2 is, I don't know, let's just say it's 180 beats per minute, right? Look at that. We have this perfect sort of graph now to determine these different heart rate zones. Now what we do, it's a piece of cake. And this is how stage training works, is that we know what VT1 is, we know what VT2 is because we tested it. Now we go halfway in between, right? 120, 180 is going to give us what? One, that's 2, 300, it's going to be 150, right? So 150 is the midpoint, right? And so look what we just did, right? So there's zone 1, this is zone 2. So any heart rate that your client is at that's between 120 and 150 is zone 2. Zone 3 is midpoint to VT2, and then zone 4 training is going to be above VT2. Now, just so you know, because you may have seen this, or you'll hear it, or you'll read it, we can also make some correlation, believe it or not, between the predicted max heart rate and the percent of predicted max heart rate. Normally what you'll see is this is going to be roughly 60%, 75%, something like that. This could be upwards of 90% of predicted max heart rate, something like that. I'm gonna take those off because I don't want to confuse you. Because stage training basically says, and of course you've actually got some pretty good figures in here that you can look at. But I hope this makes sense in that as long as, look, this is what we did. We know what that is. It's easy to measure. We know what this is because that's easy to measure. This we're using the Tanaka formula. And we have three basic variables that we got a pretty good idea of. And then we can measure that at some point. That's great. If we have these 4 pieces of information, these 4 variables, we can develop and create an entire program for the average person. Yay, it's pretty cool. And so what stage training says is that using these zones, we can now determine the frequency, right? The amount of time a person spends in here in these zones, and whatnot. So I hope that again is helpful. The average person, when they start to train, generally just don't even look at things like this. But this is a pretty straightforward way. And now as we get through the rest of chapter 15, that's where the focus is going to be. So stage 1 training basically says warm up within zone 1. You know, I remember when aerobics, the concept of aerobics came out, actually 1980s, people were doing aerobic training. And the reality was that no, actually people were not doing aerobic training, they were doing anaerobic. People were training in zone 3 and zone 2 because they felt like they needed to train really hard and sweat to get the feeling that they were working. When the reality is that, oh no, actually zone 1 training below VT1 or at VT1 is where you need to spend the majority of your time. Okay, it's not 1960 anymore. It's not 1970 anymore. We have so much data and research. It tells us that, ironically enough, you don't want to spend a whole lot of training time in zone 2. And again, you could look through that, but table 1510 basically gives you a really good understanding of the different training zones. Let's look at the stages. Stage 1 training. Warm up well below VT1, and then the majority of the time is trying to get an individual to increase their time below VT1 up to about 30 minutes. Now, keep in mind, people in stage 1 might not be able to complete 10 to 15 minutes below VT1. We don't want them going above because it's uncomfortable when you get into zone 2. So stage 1, here's what you do. And that's what figure 15.1 tells you. And then you do a cool down. Stage 2 training Okay, figure 15.2. Stage 2 training says warm up for 5 to 10 minutes. By the way, everybody's warming up for 5 to 10 minutes below VT1. Okay, so it's very light to moderate. Now we're going to spend a minute or so, roughly a minute, doing interval training, and that's what stage 2 aerobic interval programming is all about. So think about, you warm up, and then however you're going to do it, by the way, pedaling faster with more resistance on the bike, increasing the incline on a treadmill, increasing the speed on a treadmill. And now you're going to get into zone 2, right? You're going above VT1, where it gets a little uncomfortable, and you're going to spend a minute in there. One of the things I like to do is I have a stationary spin bike. Spin bikes are the best, right? Make sure you get a good one with a substantial 35 to 40 pound. Heavier the flywheel, the better. And what I like to do is I'll do my warm up, and then when I go into my intervals, I turn the resistance up just enough, right? Just enough to where I can stand up on a spin bike and just crank for 30 seconds up to a minute, and then back it down. And by the way, I'm wearing a heart rate monitor. I don't even have to think about it. I simply look at my heart rate monitor, and it tells me, boom, I'm back down to 60% max heart rate, 65%. I know my numbers. We want our clients to know their numbers, obviously. And then you just do that for however long the duration of the training occurs, and then you do a cool down. And you can see now, as we're moving through this chapter, you're getting a bead on what the ideal training regimen looks like for cardio training. Stage 2, steady state aerobic exercise will, and as you can see, figure 5.3, if the person is not going to do interval training, we warm up and then get them into zone 2 training, right? Get them up above VT2 and maintain that for 20 to 30 minutes. It's boring as heck for me to do that. I much prefer doing interval training, but there are clients that might actually like to do that. And then, of course, the warm down. Stage 3, you read through that. Stage 3 now on figure 15.4 has a person going into zone 3. Where is zone 3? Well, that's getting close, midway between VT1 and VT2, right? On the upper end is going to be zone 3 training. Zone 3 training could be pretty intense. The idea, of course, is that individuals will move and progress through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then ultimately into stage 4. Stage 4 training is for advanced clients, because stage 4 is going to push people into zone 4. And zone 4 is at VT2 and above. Now, there are other ways, particularly runners will do an advanced stage 4 type of training, where they will look to move into close to predicted max heart rate training and try to hold that for 5 seconds, maybe up to 10 seconds if they can. But now you get the idea. Stage 4 training involves a high level of intensity. You don't want the average client. Look, for the most part, most of your clients will never get into stage 4 training. Majority of them might never get into stage 3 training, okay, where they're pushing or getting close to VT2. And then, of course, there's stage 5. This is sports specific training. This is kind of what I was talking about. You will find that sometimes sprinters will do some of this training, but this is really based on a periodization training routine. They are just not going to spend a whole lot of time in stage 5 training. I've trained high-level endurance athletes who are looking to maximize their ability to, at the end of a race, be able to buffer the development of lactate. So stage 5 training has often been called lactic acid or lactate buffering training. It's very sports specific. Don't do it unless you've already progressed. You don't do stage 5 unless you can functionally work in stage 4. Don't do stage 4 training unless you can functionally work in stage 3 training, which is why most clients will never move into it. When you get to page 507, we now talk about the postural considerations, cardiorespiratory training. And some of the problems we see are what we talked about, of course, in previous chapters relative to just postural issues and conditions: forward head, rounded shoulder, anterior pelvic tilt, adduction and internal rotation of the knees, and these other issues that are related. So you got to be careful, because the ability to breathe properly and inspire and expire properly is related to posture. Now, again, keep in mind, when you're getting fatigued, right? You get fatigued, you are going to move into these postural positions that could be detrimental to your client's ability to breathe in and out. And so you will even find the type of training. For instance, if you're on a bike, the normal position when you're on a bike is actually to move into a spinal and hip flex position. Think about it. If you ever look at a triathlete, right? They get into these hunched forward positions to maximize aerodynamics, but in reality, they're in really poor postural conditions. Now, they're advanced athletes, so they're only doing that normally during their training time and their competition. And what they should be doing is then working to counteract and regulate that poor postural position with other training. And we do a lot of stretching and a lot of postural training to strengthen the muscles of the posterior chain and the muscles in the middle back, so that the individual does not develop overactive and underactive muscle imbalancing. So just think about that for a second. That's a good use of that information that's in the previous chapters. Really, really neat stuff once you start using it in the real world. So rounded shoulders, anterior pelvic tilt, right? We've gone over this. So you can read through this. Just keep in mind that treadmill is a great way to start people off. If we put detrained individuals who already have postural distortions due to muscle imbalances, right? So they already have, an anterior pelvic tilt, just as a for instance, putting them on a bike might not be the best way to begin a client off on their training. Maybe a better way is to have them do it on a treadmill if possible, to walk, things like that. So, and that's what's going to finish up chapter 15 for us. Remember, read the summary, chapter review, got some great chapter highlights. Keep in mind the focus here is on stage training, stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, using ventilatory threshold 1 and VT2 to create these. They're not arbitrary now, right? That's the beauty of it. It's not arbitrary. We're using very specific biomarkers to develop zones, these areas of heart rate, right? Low and high heart rate, min max heart rate levels within these zones, to help us determine where the client should be training, at what heart rate percentage or heart rate levels within these particular zones. So now stage training tells us, stay in this zone for this amount of time, intervals into here, all the way up into zone 4 if you're going to do that. And that's what helps us to appreciate all this great information in chapter 15. So again, that ends that chapter, and I will see you then again in chapter 16.